I just listened to every album by Pink Floyd, and here are my thoughts. So going in, I knew what everyone knows about Pink Floyd, and that is Dark Side of the Moon and The Wall. I didn't really grow up around these albums. I didn't always really like Pink Floyd. I think part of the reason for that is, whether I have ADHD or not, I've never been diagnosed, but I have some symptoms of ADHD, and every time I would listen to Pink Floyd, I just couldn't stay focused. My mind would wander because Pink Floyd's music is, it's very slow, it's very relaxing, it's very dreamy. So I hadn't even really listened to Dark Side of the Moon all the way through until, I think, around 5 years ago. And then I listened to The Wall all the way through. A couple years after that, I actually watched the movie The Wall. The moment that I got Pink Floyd was I went to a store here. I live in Washington. It's a legal state, and I got this little THC edible gummy, and it was the first time I had ever done THC. And while I was just laying on the couch, letting it sink in, I just suddenly realized, oh, that's why people like Pink Floyd. Ever since then, I just my brain had a little switch, and I realized how good Pink Floyd actually is. But I still hadn't listened to anything besides those two albums until right about now. So Pink Floyd starts off in 1967 with Piper at the Gates of Dawn. I thought this album was really cool. It's before Pink Floyd really found their signature sound, and it being in 1967, it's kind of like an experimental, darker version of Sgt. Pepper's, because that's kind of what psychedelic rock was at the time. This era of Pink Floyd and this sound was pretty short-lived, as their guitarist and founding member Syd Barrett had increasingly become unstable and unable to cope with the responsibilities of being in a band, especially when the other band members were really targeting fame and getting popular, and that didn't really seem to be Syd Barrett's jam. So Syd is increasingly less involved in the following albums, and they recruit David Gilmour, who is their main guitarist for the rest of the band's career, and they release Saucerful of Secrets the year after Piper at the Gates of Dawn. Saucerful of Secrets was a pretty cool album. Like a lot of their albums in this era and following this, it does lean a bit in an experimental direction, which sometimes lands, sometimes does not. If there's 10 minutes worth of ambient background noise, then some people might like that in a Pink Floyd album. To me, it kind of detracts, especially since these were only 45-ish minute albums, and a quarter of it is just kind of ambient background noise. So what I tended to like more was the shorter, maybe a little bit more accessible songs, whether they were very soft and relaxing or whether they were a little bit heavier. So they released More and Uma Guma, both in 1969. More was a film soundtrack, and I did really enjoy this album. It doesn't really have the emotional substance that most Pink Floyd albums do, but it does have a lot of songs that are just easy to flip to and enjoy. A few songs that were a little heavier as well, heavier than anything Pink Floyd had done so far. And then Uma Guma was pretty challenging to listen to because it's bad. Grantchester Meadows was off this album, was a good song. Almost everything else was just kind of experimental nonsense. And to their credit, this is the only bad album that Pink Floyd really has. The following three albums, Atom Heart Mother, Metal, and Obscured by Clouds, are a display of their sound still gradually changing. I found Atom Heart Mother to be very easy listening, very relaxing. And then Metal was an interesting one. This is when I first noticed that Pink Floyd is starting to really sound like Pink Floyd, especially in the title track. It's a really long song, and about half of it is just experimental ambient noise. The other half was actual music, and that music sounds a lot like the Pink Floyd that I'm looking forward to in something like Dark Side of the Moon. Atom Heart Mother and Metal both have really deep emotional substance. And then the next album, Obscured by Clouds, is kind of like if those two albums were combined with More. And when I say that, I mean like every song on Obscured by Clouds is a shorter song, really easy to flip to, rather than something that's very signature in Pink Floyd, which is longer songs and albums that are meant to be listened to all together. And so all these albums were solid enough, but nothing like what comes next, Dark Side of the Moon. I don't know what I could say about Dark Side of the Moon that hasn't already been said. I fully believe it is one of the best albums of all time, if not the best. It is my favorite Pink Floyd album. It is an absolute masterpiece. Not a single minute is wasted on this amazing album. Time especially just blows my mind. Like, here, guys, I think they were in their mid-20s, and it's amazing that they were introspective enough to write a song like Time that is very ruminating on mortality and the shortage of time in our own lives. So this begins what has to be one of the best 4-album runs in history, because Wish You Were Here is next, which is mainly an album that touches on 2 themes. One is a criticism of the music industry, but secondly, and I believe more prominently, it is an album that is a tribute to Syd Barrett, who is now totally absent from the band. This album features absolutely giant songs like Shine On You Crazy Diamond, and the title track Wish You Were Here, which is maybe my other favorite Pink Floyd song besides Time. Following that is Animals, and this is an interesting album. It doesn't have, to me at least, it didn't have the amazing highs that Dark Side and Wish You Were Here had, but it is consistently really good all the way through. Like, maybe nothing in here that's 10 out of 10, but it is like 9 out of 10 the entire way through. It is obvious that the band is really in the groove with this. They had a full cohesive idea and they executed it really well. And then comes The Wall, which is regarded as Pink Floyd's other masterpiece. This is an album where Roger Waters especially shines. He's taken over a lot of the songwriting, and his style of songwriting, which is very lyrics forward, is what is mainly prominent on this album. And this album is a beautiful, tragic masterpiece. Whereas Dark Side of the Moon was more philosophically focused, this album is more politically focused, and it is a criticism of war and imperialism and problems that he saw in the British government. A lot of it stemming from him losing his dad in a war. Now, The Wall, lyrically and emotionally, is a very multi-dimensional album. The next album, The Final Cut, is if you took one of the specific emotional dimensions of The Wall and then made an entire album out of that. So it's not a bad album, it's just when I was listening to it, I was thinking this sounds a lot like The Wall, just not as good. So if I'm going to go back to one of these albums, I'd prefer to go back to The Wall. At this point, you would think that David Gilmour was going to be the one leaving the band, because his songwriting has been pretty much absent. But it's actually Roger Waters that leaves the band and David Gilmour that carries it on. And Pink Floyd releases, after this, Momentary Lapse of Reason in 1987, which I didn't really love. It's an awkward attempt to make an 80s prominent sound with 80s-like bass lines. The lyrics on this album were a weak point as well. It felt very, very amateurish. Not all is lost, though, because in 1994, year I was born, they release The Division Bell. And this album, I thought, was beautiful. It still has a little bit of a changing sound, a little bit of Pink Floyd and David Gilmour adapting to a changing music landscape. But it still has enough of the classic Pink Floyd sound. It's just mixed with a newer kind of 90s sound. I thought it sounded like if Pink Floyd and U2 kind of had a baby. Then imagine the best possible version of that union, and that's what The Division Bell sounds like. 20 years later, they released their final album, The Endless River, which is really just ambient instrumental outtakes from the Division Bell sessions. A lot of it sounded kind of new agey to me, like if you have a crazy great aunt that is into like Reiki massages, this sounds like something that she'd be into. I'm running out of time. There are my favorite Pink Floyd albums. I am sure about the top 4 and the bottom 3. Everything else is really hard to rank. And I'm going to have my favorite Pink Floyd songs in a part 2. So thank you for watching.